Boldwood presents Fire and Fury for the Tobacco Girls, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Penelope Freeman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Bristol, the 3rd of January 1941. Bridget Milligan and Maisie Miles. The ambulance careered through total darkness, bouncing over potholes, missing lampposts by inches, skimming round corners and passing familiar landmarks barely discernible against a blanket of blackness. Bridget Milligan, in her capacity as first aider, clung on with her left hand, her bottom bumping up and down on the passenger seat. With her free hand she yanked the emergency bell for all she was worth, its loud clatter joining a tumultuous choir of other ambulance and fire engine bells, clanging and jangling as each raced to where they were needed. It might be a bit too much to hope that the raid wouldn't go on too long, that some sleep might be snatched before morning. Harry Flinders, production operative in the tobacco factory by day, but ambulance driver tonight, was hunched over the steering wheel in an effort to better see the road ahead of him in the midst of the blackout. Street after street of blackness steadily blended to grey, then a pale, dirty lemon colour, which in turn exploded to a reddish gold. It got warmer and warmer until the sweat trickled down Bridget's neck and then her spine. At last, the heat was there before them, buildings smouldering against a blanket of orange. "They don't look like flames," she muttered, her voice sounding unusually small and far away. "Well, they are." Harry's curmudgeonly tone put her off saying what she wanted to say, that it was as though somebody had daubed the night sky with a huge brush dipped into a tin of bright orange paint. If hell could ever be on earth, then this was it. Night had become day, and the cold receded with the heat of bombs that had found targets and exploded with grim ferocity. Having been told there'd been indiscriminate bombing on St. Michael's Hill, they had gone from Bedminster towards the city centre. They'd heard that other areas of Bristol were also experiencing air raids. It was a big one, the raiders having followed the River Avon from its mouth into the city, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. Harry considered himself a bit of an armchair strategist, so had plenty to say on the subject. "They let loose their main load on Avonmouth and Filton, harbour and airplanes, and having a few left decided to drop them on people. Bloody Germans. Oh, God." Harry's jaw went slack, and the cigarette that had been jammed in the corner of his mouth fell to the floor. "Good God," he exclaimed. "St. Michael's Hill, Redcliffe, all houses." The ambulance swerved to avoid a fire engine and only barely got away with it. Bridget swiped at the beads of sweat on her forehead. Her navy blue siren suit, so called because it was an item of clothing donned the minute the air raid siren went off, if not before, felt hot and restrictive. The cold night might help, though thankfully there had been no snow this year, so no vegetables lost to extreme cold. New Year had been just a few days ago. Some of the residents of Marksbury Road had got together for a party. There'd been a little beer and sherry, along with sausage rolls made without meat, and fish paste sandwiches. There was always fish paste to be had. Bridget vaguely wondered how much fish paste would have been eaten by the time this war was over. Thinking of trivial things helped her cope with the scene beginning to unfold outside of the vehicle. She thought of her big family in Marksbury Road, of her friends at the tobacco factory, Maisie, who was in another ambulance, and Phyllis, who was serving abroad. She thought of the love of her life, Lyndon O'Neill, who was far away but still in her heart. Suddenly, the whole horror of war had come home and was there before her. "Oh, God," she muttered. The windscreen proved no barrier to the increased heat she could feel on her face. The tight knot in her stomach that she'd had since the moment the air raid siren had sounded tightened so much that it seemed her stomach was cleaved to her spine. This was her first time as first aid assistant on one of the ambulances supplied by WD&HO Wills. Months of the phony war when nothing seemed to happen had made people think that nothing ever would. The retreat from Dunkirk had surprised and shocked, and the air raids on Bristol had been relatively light until the heavy raid of the 24th of November. It was on that terrible night that she'd been forced to shelter in a wine cellar beneath St. Nicholas Market. Maisie and Phyllis, her very best friends and workmates from the tobacco factory, had been with her. She sometimes wondered whether the experience had influenced Phyllis into joining up, besides her chaotic personal life. Phyllis seemed to fall in love at the fall of a hat, or what she thought was love. First there'd been Robert, her fiancé, who became her husband. She might not have married him if she hadn't been pregnant, but as it turned out, she'd lost both husband and the baby she'd been expecting, fathered by her typing teacher. Her eyes misted at those precious moments with her friends. Once the raid was over, they'd walked home, taking detours as advised by air raid wardens, remarking sadly that they'd never go shopping in Castle Street ever again. The medieval heart of Bristol had been destroyed, old buildings that had stood for centuries reduced to rubble and dust, obliterated. It was back then that WD&HO Wills, one of the city's biggest employers and producers of cigarettes, cigars, snuff and pipe tobacco, had organised its own ambulances and facilitated the training of staff to man them. But the writing was on the wall. By the following raids of early December, they were up and running. Bridget had swallowed the fear and declared the country needed them. "It's our duty," she had said to her good friend Maisie Miles. In response, Maisie, younger and slighter than Bridget and brave of heart, had declared that it might be fun, so accordingly they had put their names forward. Maisie had grown up in a tough neighbourhood, neglected by her mother and stepfather. She'd not been keen to work in the tobacco factory, but on doing so had found true friendship with Bridget and Phyllis. There'd been 3 of them, but now there were only 2 still working in there. It was certainly a bit different to their day job. Besides, the short 6-week course on basic first aid practicing on willing patients, and despite the serious intent of the training, overall it had turned out to be fun. Maisie and Bridget had taken turns to be patients and allotted a specific injury and bandaged accordingly. Both she and Maisie had learned a lot and giggled a lot, especially when Maisie had drawn the short straw and been given a complete body bandaging. "We can't move," she spluttered through her bandaged mouth. Bridget had told her that she looked like an Egyptian mummy. Maisie's muffled response had been to say that bandaging wasn't necessary and all that she needed for her injury was a cup of tea. Such an innocent time, she thought, as fear prickled all over her skin. Her courage was diminished, and in its diminishment she found herself wishing it had stayed as fun, wished there'd been no more air raids. But there had. A new year had dawned, and Bristol was once more under attack. "I thought they were after the aeroplane works," she said in as brave a tone as she could muster. Everyone knew Bristol, with its large port, excellent railway connections, and most of all its aeroplane works, was a prime target. Harry Flinders scowled through his sweat. "They was, but their aim ain't as good as it could be. They ain't RAF. They're the boys that do it right." Bridget was none too sure about his boast, but liked to think he was right. Being in the right and being better at things made everyone feel braver. "It looks like a rank of houses." Harry nodded, said yep, but nothing else. His expression hardened. "Poor buggers, chucked out of their bed." Bridget gulped. This was the first night both she and Maisie had become operational. They'd been apprehensive, both fully aware that this would be very different from practicing on perfectly healthy people and in a safe environment. All that she'd learned on the course broke into fragments at the sight of the flames. "Here we go," muttered Harry as the vehicle came to a shuddering halt. He fell out of the door on his side, slamming it shut behind him. Bridget did the same on her side, one shoulder weighed down by her first aid kit. The heat hit her. Water gushing from firemen's hoses quickly turned to steam. It was a scene from hell, and the air she breathed tasted gritty. She wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, and more grittiness transferred to her lips. Cinders from burning buildings were like fireflies rising skywards, the air full of the sound of water thundering from fire hoses trained on fierce flames, black smoke soaring. Bridget's attention was drawn to the arrival of yet another ambulance sporting a WD&HO Wills logo. An air raid warden, silhouetted against the fire, shouted at it, "Shut that bloody rocket!" Maisie fell out of the new arrival. Like Bridget, she was grasping her first aid kit. Her driver, old Fred Winter, who'd retired some years before from driving company vans and lorries, but had been brought in to help, climbed stiffly down from the other side. "Crikey!" exclaimed Maisie as she came to a halt beside Bridget. They both stared round-eyed at the terrible scene being played out before them. "Is anyone injured?" Bridget asked an ARP warden, who was bent almost double, hands on knees as he coughed and spluttered, then cleared his throat in an effort to catch his breath. He looked at them pityingly with red-rimmed eyes and a face blackened from the choking smoke. "You'll get more than injured." Just as Bridget was about to ask him if there was anything she could do to help, a man began waving at them, adjacent to where the fire hoses had doused the worst of the fire, though the rubble smouldered like coal. "Don't stand there gawping, come over here." "On our way," Maisie shouted back. "Better leave these here," Bridget said, laying down her first aid box where the ground was clear. "Keep an eye on them, will you?" added Maisie, speaking to Fred. "People's lives might depend on it." Bridget frowned at her. "Maisie, nobody's going to steal first aid boxes." "You don't think so? Well, Bridget Milligan, you don't come from where I come from." Bridget didn't respond. Maisie had grown up in the Dings, a pretty grim area where the stink of the boneyards and the soap factories fouled the air. Her father, who she'd later found out to be her stepfather, had been a small-time criminal who was currently imprisoned for selling rotten meat on the black market. As a result of that, 2 children had died, and many others become very ill. He was likely to serve 10 years at least. Her mother, downtrodden and abused all her married life, was dead, and Maisie now lived with her grandmother, Grace Wells, who also happened to be the mother of Maisie's natural father. One thing Maisie had gained from living a rough life was guts and outright honesty. If you wanted an honest opinion, Maisie was the one you went to. Her courage was indisputable, as she was currently demonstrating. Arms outstretched so she could better keep her balance, she picked her way over the debris of what had once been the upper stories of a house of some age, one of a terrace. "Go careful," the man shouted. "The upper floors have collapsed on top of the cellar, but there might still be somebody down there. And no more water. This bit's out. Don't want to bloody drown 'em." Bridget and Harry followed on until the 3 of them joined a huddled band of auxiliary firemen and rescuers, silently scrutinising one particular spot. Harry asked if somebody was trapped. The man rounded on him. "Course somebody's trapped, you big lummock. Now shut your gob. I can't hear bugger all with you yapping." "Sorry, I'm sure," murmured Harry. "Never you mind, Harry," said Maisie in an extra loud voice that nobody could help but hear, including the bloke who'd told Harry to shut up. "When somebody needs a big bloke to lift something heavy, you're the man for the job." The man was unimpressed and glared pointedly at Maisie. "I said, shut your gobs." "Just pointing out a fact, just in case," said an unperturbed Maisie in a smaller voice, though still with a cocky tilt to her head. All round them, people clambered like ants over mounds of rubble and blackened timbers. Steam rose and mixed with the smoke from fires that were still burning, making the air a claustrophobic fog that was difficult to see through. The man who'd shouted at Harry now shouted again. "Well, don't just stand there, grab a shovel." "Keep your hair on," snapped Maisie. Harry was ordered to another area, where plumes of smoke were turning to a cloud of hissing steam thanks to the rush of water from a fire hose. "I can hear tapping," somebody shouted out. "Give us a bit of quiet." The clattering of tools and chatter amongst the rescuers stopped abruptly. Even though the fire wasn't fully put out, the firemen turned off their hoses. The only sound remaining was the hissing of steam from smouldering timbers. "It's coming from back here," somebody shouted. "But I'm warning you, it ain't safe. 1 foot wrong and it's downhill all the bloody way." The man who looked to be in charge surveyed the band of rescue workers. "Can I have a volunteer to have a go?" "I'll go." "It's Harry," said Bridget. Maisie poked at the brim of her tin hat, so it was shoved further back on her head. "That's brave of him." With bated breath shared with all those round them, they watched as Harry began to make his way across mangled metal, shards of what had been doors, towards where a staircase hung precariously from a wall. Just like the other houses, the upper story of the house had fallen down and piled on top of the cellar. If anyone had survived, that was where they would be. A piece of wallpaper had come adrift from the wall and was fluttering like a flag above the staircase to nowhere. It was decorated with characters from nursery rhymes. "Hey, diddle diddle," whispered Bridget woefully. "Please God, let them have survived." "The cat and the fiddle," returned Maisie, swallowing the bile that accompanied the words. Thinking of the child that might have been sleeping in that room, the family preferring to take their chance rather than go to the shelter, made her feel sick to her stomach. A quick glance at Bridget's tense expression was enough to tell her that their thoughts were running along the same lines. The family might or might not have made the wrong choice. It could indeed be that a survivor was tapping on a water or gas pipe, and that the child too was alive and being held in a loving embrace. She closed her eyes tightly and willed that it was so. Somebody close by suggested that the family might have gone to the shelter, and it really was only the sound of water hammer. A senior fireman pushed his way through, the others making room, their dirty faces tensing as they waited to act on his judgment of the situation. Hands resting on knees, he bent over and looked and listened, then held up a hand, a signal for everyone to be quiet. There was a sound like breaking glass when he took a step forward, along with 2 of the others. "Stop!" he shouted. The raised hand again. "We need to get closer. But I reckon this is too thin a layer to take our weight. We don't need a heavyweight, we need a bantamweight." A man who was indeed a bit thinner than anyone else offered to go further forward and take a closer look. The fire officer glanced at him before shaking his head. "If you're any more than about 8 stone, you'll go right through before you can get there." A lone voice rang out into the fragile silence. "I'm a bantamweight. More like 7 stone in me bare feet." Maisie's face was gilded with gold and made Bridget think of the statues of saints in the Catholic Church, more richly attired than when they'd been flesh and blood and not painted plaster. The 3 men standing at the heart of the desolation eyed Maisie's slight frame, and the fireman, a man of senior office and used to being in charge of such situations, beckoned her forward. "Now listen carefully," he said, a thick moustache quivering with bits of soot and grit. "All you gotta do is shine a torch down into the hole and see what's there. I can see the rim of the hole from here, so I know there is one. Got that?" "I got it." "Right. John, fetch a rope and tie it around her waist." Its use was explained. "So we can pull you up if you fall through. We shouldn't have any trouble doing that, you being such a lightweight." "Good job for you," said Maisie in her normal cheeky style. Inside, she was scared, but nicely so. She was going to help someone. It was what she'd always wanted to do. Up until the January raid, she'd been at a distance from this war. Now she was part of it, feeling useful, but also important because people would be depending on her.
"Take this torch. Shine it down into the hole."
"I heard you the first time. I know what I gotta do." Heart in her mouth, she showed a bit of bravado at first, stepping forward as though everything was perfectly flat, perfectly normal. Her manner was more to reassure herself rather than impress anyone else, not that she would ever admit it, now or in the future. A sudden shift of debris slowed her progress. Common sense and the will to survive came into play. Ahead of her were lumps of brickwork. A gas oven lay on its side next to the handle of a pram or pushchair, more evidence of a child. The closer she got to her objective, the stronger the smell of gas. She paused on thinking she heard something, waved her hand, signalling total silence from those behind her. The sound was still there. Tapping. "Is anyone there?" she called out. The sound of her voice started a small avalanche of rubble. She held her breath. She dared call again. "Hello?" There was a sound. Not a word as such, but a grunting, snoring, bordering on a squeal. Toe, then heel, she took one step, paused for the sound of more falling rubble. Took another step, again toe forward, then heel following. It was such a tiny advance, but she knew it to be necessary. Her life, and perhaps also those trapped, depended on it. She allowed her mind to stray on how it would be with these people when they heard she'd been instrumental in saving them. That would be a very glad day indeed. And her mind, dwelling on a positive outcome, helped keep fear at bay. The rough ground, the broken woodwork, the stones and brick and busted furniture posed obstacles, but she judged she was close to the tapping and the other sounds she could hear. Suddenly her foot slipped and she cried out. In response to her shout, the rope round her waist became taut. "You all right, my love?" She swallowed hard. Her heart was racing like a train, but she hadn't fallen. A few more steps and all would be well. The beam from the flashlight bounced over all the things that made a home. A broken teapot, battered saucepans, the ragged fringe of a rug, twists of cloth and linoleum. After that there was nothing, the column of light disappearing into a gaping hole. "I'm there," she shouted over her shoulder. "Just give me a bit of slack." They'd been holding her too tightly, wary lest she disappear out of sight at any moment. The tautness eased. Taking a deep breath, she took another step, another, and finally a fourth one. "Hello?" she called, her voice dropping down the hole, along with the light she was levelling down there. That odd sound again, somewhere off to her right. First there was only a jumble of items. Most prominent amongst it was a cast-iron fireplace, a huge Victorian one. Steadying her hand, her gaze followed the light from the torch. A little cry escaped from her throat. It looked like a gas pipe had come loose from fixings that had kept it firmly attached to a wall. Nothing held it now. The whole length of pipe was swinging backwards and forwards, tapping the mantelpiece of the fireplace. She chose to believe that they weren't all dead and reminded herself of the grunting, snoring sound she'd heard. Determined that someone should come out of this alive, she tried again to locate someone, anyone, who might have survived. Suddenly, there were two faces. She gulped, and in doing so breathed in some of the thick dust that lay heavy on the air. The dust coated her tongue, and she needed to spit. In an act of reverence, she turned her head so that whatever she spat out would not land on the pale faces beneath her. Chilled, but determined, she dragged her gaze back to the job in hand. Not job. People. They were dead, but still people. Taking a firm grip on her emotions, she took in the details. One was an adult, a woman, if her fine cheekbones were anything to go by. The other was a child. Their eyes were closed, and their faces shone whitely, which she guessed was dust from the plaster of fallen ceilings and tumbled walls. In a way, they looked peaceful, but it did nothing to take away the sheer horror of the scene. They might just as well have been in bed together, buried as they were beneath the surround of a marble fireplace, their dust-covered faces framed by an inner band of decorative tiles. Her breath caught in her throat before she whispered to herself, "No, I heard something." Someone behind her was asking loudly if she had found anything. She stared down at the two faces, which didn't look real. They were too still, too lifeless. The child's head lay on its mother's chest. The mother's arms hugged the child close in a useless act of protection. She became vaguely aware of another face behind both of them. The face turned slightly away. It was hard not to sob, hard not to cry. With her free hand, she brushed at the wetness trickling down her face. She heard nothing and saw nothing except white, dust-covered faces.
"Are you ready to come back?"
She felt the rope tightening around her waist. They were preparing for her to back away, reeling her in as they might a fish on the end of a line. "Yes," she shouted, her voice strident and oddly confident. Bit by bit and very slowly, she retraced her steps, though backwards instead of forwards. It wasn't easy, but she had faith in the men bringing her back to the surface, and all she had to do was place her feet as close as possible to the steps she'd taken earlier. She was shaking like a leaf when her feet finally found solid ground and the rope was being untied. She'd seen her mother die, but not like this. Never like this. Bridget pushed her way through. "You all right, Maisie?" She sounded worried. It was obvious to everyone from her expression that nothing was all right. She sniffed and wiped her nose on the cuff of her sleeve. "They're dead. 2 for definite, though it could be 3. I thought I heard something, but—"
"It's a pig! It's a bloody pig!"
The interruption came from Harry, who, although he'd been told he was too heavy for the route she'd taken, had gone his own way. A crowd headed in his direction. "Finders keepers," somebody shouted. One of the rescuers, she couldn't tell who, patted her on the back.
"Job well done," he said solemnly. "We'll get them out as quick as we can. Got your stretcher handy?"
Maisie nodded.
"No need. I'll do it,"
said Bridget.
"No."
Maisie was shaking, but adamant.
"I found them. I'll get them to the morgue."
He shook his head.
"Poor sods. They stayed in the house to keep their pig from thieves."
Maisie looked at him in shocked surprise.
"A pig? A real pig?"
He rubbed at his face, making white patches in the sooty sweat that covered it, then nodded.
"Everyone's got to eat and takes care of their own. By the looks of it, the family were keeping a pig in the back garden, probably a joint ownership between neighbours. They couldn't risk leaving it alone and it not being there when they got back from the shelter. So they stayed put to guard the pig. Even in the middle of a bombing raid, there's thieves about. Didn't do 'em much good though, did it?"
His voice and expression was sombre.
"They ain't lost their bacon, but they've lost their lives."
Chapter 2. Maisie. After such a stressful ordeal, sleep came but fitfully. Maisie tossed and turned all weekend, a vision of waxen faces staring up from out of dark earth and rubble. Every sense replayed the details, the sight, the smell, the heat, and the taste of ashes in her mouth. No matter how much she tried to get some sleep, Their lifeless faces remained fixed in her mind, the dream refusing to shift. The tapping she recalled so well roused her to half-consciousness and became a knocking, louder than she recalled. "Maisie, child!" The knocking ceased, and a warm hand lay on her shoulder. Though her face was implacable, there was concern in the failing eyes of her grandmother, Grace Wells. Maisie pushed herself up onto her elbows, aware that she was bathed in sweat, yet also shivering. "I had a nightmare." Grace's face was never softly smiling. She wasn't a cosy grandmother who sat in a rocking chair knitting, but she was caring and pragmatic with it. "Let it out. Break the dream and it won't come back." Maisie told her the dream, which mirrored her baptism of fire, except in her dream the rope that had been her safety connection to the volunteers gathered behind her had snapped. Screaming at the top of her voice, she had fallen into the hole, landing on those who had died in their house rather than go to the shelter. She also told her the reason why they hadn't gone to the shelter. She waited for her grandmother to raise her eyebrows at the mention of the pig, but she didn't. Instead, she sighed and shook her head. "Who can blame him? It was bad enough trying to put a meal on the table during the 30s and the Great Depression. Worse in a war when nobody knows what's round the corner. Family comes first, whatever the risk. People will do anything to feed their family." Her grandmother's gnarled hand patted her knee. "I'll go down and get you a cup of cocoa." Maisie knew better than to suggest that she went down and got it. That would only result in a sharp rebuke, a reminder that Grace had lived in this house for years and knew her way around without the need for sight. Instead, she lay back against the pillow, feeling more at home than she'd ever felt in her life. Yet things could have been so different. It had come as a shock and also relief to learn that Frank Miles was not her natural father. She'd hated him. Before she'd died, her mother had told her to seek out her natural father's mother, Grace Wells. It was the best thing her mother had ever done, and the best thing Maisie had done in taking that advice. Grace Wells was tough, but then so was she. Plus, she'd grown up without affection, so didn't expect it. What she got from her grandmother was a support she'd never received from anyone else. Grace Wells was by no means perfect, but her heart was in the right place. The only other person she'd been close with was her half-brother, Alf. Not that she'd heard much from him. He was away serving with the Merchant Navy, mostly on the beef and grain ships coming up from South America, and he wasn't much of a one for writing letters. Every so often a card arrived, some with pictures of exotic places like Rio de Janeiro, Caracas and Montevideo. In time they'd meet up again if his ship came into Bristol, or if the war finally ended and he had managed to stay safe. She wondered what he would make of her grandmother, if she should ever tell him the absolute truth, that is. On the first occasion she'd visited her grandmother, Maisie had been appalled to find out that she practiced abortions on girls who'd got into trouble. She'd vowed never to go back, but found herself drawn to this strong woman after finding out that her true father had been killed by Frank Miles, her stepfather. A known small-time criminal, Frank had been married to her late mother, with whom he'd been too free with his fists. Seeing her mother with black eyes was a regular occurrence. Maisie had been too young to do anything about any of it. Despite Frank Miles making money from anything illegal, none of it had been spent on her. Shabbily dressed and smelling of the fetid air round where they lived, she'd been shunned by many of her peer group. Spending much time alone had made her what she was, independent, outspoken, and tougher than she looked. Maisie had left school at 14 and worked for some time at the Royal Hotel on College Green, in the centre of Bristol. It was whilst there that she'd heard from her old teacher about a live-in job at a country house. To her it was like the answer to her dreams. A life away from family and from York Street sounded too good to be true. Something that, if not tightly clasped, could fly away like the feathery seeds of a dandelion clock. It turned out the dream was not to be. Frank Miles insisted Maisie took a job in the tobacco factory, for his own ends, of course. She'd hated the thought of working in a place like that, because its smell would remind her of him. Frank Miles smoked heavily, spent cigarette ends spilled from ashtrays and saucers, littered the fireplace, and dusted the few rugs that were in the house. The smell and the mess sickened her, would always be connected with him. It was very much the reason why she didn't smoke herself. As it turned out, though, she didn't regret joining the workforce at WD&H O'Wills. For the first time in her life, she made good friends there. Phyllis Mason, Bridget Milligan, and Maisie Miles. She still couldn't help smiling at their decision to call themselves the 3 M's.
Like the 3 Musketeers,
Bridget had declared. She'd warmed to them both, and thus the factory she hadn't wanted to work in had become central to her world. Bridget was clever. She read a lot and knew a lot about the history of Bristol. Phyllis was a different kettle of fish entirely. She loved looking glamorous and being admired. She'd had an effervescent personality, except when her fiancé Robert was around. He liked to be in control, tell her what she should wear, how she should behave. 2 weeks before he was due to be posted, they'd married. Both Maisie and Bridget had known that their dear friend was pregnant, though not by Robert. Wanting to improve herself, Phyllis had taken typing lessons and fallen for the man who taught the class. Whilst Robert was away, she'd lost the baby, and also received a telegram saying he was missing in action, believed killed. No word came, and so it was that she'd joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. She was a WAAF. Sometimes Maisie longed for those early days when the 3 of them had been so close. It beat what she had at home and the likely prospects in life. Stepfather Frank had also had it in mind that at some stage she would progress to working in a nightclub owned by a big-time gang leader called Eddie Bridgman. Eddie had come to their house, and the way he'd looked at her had turned her stomach. She hadn't needed her brother's advice to stay out of his way. She had every intention of doing so, not even shopping him to the coppers when she knew full well that he'd been up to no good. That way, she'd hoped to keep him at bay and enjoy life with her mates at the tobacco factory. The only time she would shop him was if he did something that was totally unpalatable, which he eventually did. 2 children had died as a consequence of him dealing in rotten meat on the black market. She'd wanted revenge without being implicated, which was where her grandmother, a known moneylender and property owner, had come in. It was Grace Wells who had called in a favour from somebody who owed her money, who also happened to be the grandmother to the 2 children who had died. So, Frank Miles had been put away for a very long time, and Maisie couldn't have been more delighted. The only bugbear was that Eddie Bridgman was still around. Somehow he'd escaped being called up. She'd heard that a medical could be fixed. He'd likely not gone for the medical, but sent somebody unfit in his stead. All she cared was that he stayed out of her way. In the meantime, she was happy, though Grace Wells was a strange woman and not altogether whiter than white. She looked just as one expected a grandmother to look, with white hair, a round face, and a kindly smile. But that was as far as being a typical grandmother went. She was tough as old boots, owned properties, lent money at high interest rates to those who had never stepped across the threshold of a bank. In the past, she had also charged unlucky young girls and women with too many mouths to feed for her services. But due to her diminishing eyesight, abortion in the back room of the house was no longer an option. Maisie liked to think she regretted having carried out such procedures. It helped her live under the same roof more easily and pretend she really was no different a grandma than any other. The slow creaking of the narrow staircase preceded the arrival of the woman she'd come to both love and respect in equal measure. Both of her hands were wrapped round a mug of cocoa.
Gone, has it?
Yes, she said, and managed to smile as she took the mug and wrapped her hands round it. You were right about the dream. Talking about it helped a lot. But then, you're always right, Gran. Chapter 3. Miss Cayford. Miss Cayford, recruitment supervisor, was thinking about Maisie Miles as she ran through the normal format for the interviewing of school leavers for the tobacco factory. She had 3 files on her desk, each one relating to the 3 new recruits sitting in front of her. First things first, though. Right, let me see your hands. 2 of the girls exchanged surprised glances. The third, who had rarely looked up from her tangled fingers, offered her hands. Turn them over. The girl, Jane, a homely-looking sort without a trace of makeup on her face, dutifully did as requested. Good clean nails, said Miss Cayford, as she looked fixedly at each of them in turn. Tobacco is a form of food. You wouldn't prepare food with dirty fingernails and hands, would you now?
S'pose not,
said the blonde Carol. Miss Cayford had already decided that this girl, who looked far older than her 14 years, was a know-it-all sort and would need to knuckle down if she was to keep her job. The workforce had been slightly reduced, but if cigarette production was to be maintained, new blood would always be required. It took time to train people, and what with the call-up, it made sense to take on the younger ones to fill the dropout rate of those joining the forces. Hence the fact that Maisie Miles's file was also on her desk. Maisie was about to be promoted. She was young, but my goodness, she was of strong character. On first being employed at the factory, she'd been a little shabby, but her hands and face had been beautifully clean. WD&HO Wills had very high standards and encouraged improvement. Maisie had certainly improved during her short time with the factory. The other girl, Pauline, followed Carol's lead, looking at her as she offered her own hands, turning them over in the same casually impudent way as her new colleague was doing. Her attitude did not go unnoticed by Miss Cayford. Do you 2 know each other? The 2 girls exchanged smiles that fitted their attitudes.
No, she ain't no friend of mine, but that ain't to say we won't be, ain't that right?
Carol smiled and winked at Pauline, who seemed to bloom at this easily endowed privilege. Do any of you knit? The sudden question took both Carol and Pauline by surprise. Carol giggled.
No.
Jane querulously raised her hand.
Yes, miss.
The other 2 sniggered. Ah, good to know that you've got dexterous fingers. We like dexterous fingers here at Wills. She turned to the others. And what about you, Pauline?
Yeah, a bit.
Miss Cayford fancied she saw a tiny flush and knew the defiance in Pauline's lofty headshake was in direct response to wanting Carol to feel she was on her side. She wanted a buddy and somebody to lead the way. Pauline was a follower and easily led. Carol met Miss Cayford's look with a shifty one.
Ain't got the patience, prefer reading.
Oh, really? Said Miss Cayford, pleased. Perhaps this girl wasn't as rebellious as she thought. What sort of books do you like to read? Carol smirked as she replied.
Not books. I likes magazines, picture posts, film stars and stuff.
I see, said Miss Cayford, somewhat disappointed. She'd hoped for some sign of Carol being open to further education. Her hopes were dashed. Right, said Miss Cayford, closing the personnel files of the 3 girls. A decision regarding the supervision of the new girls had been made. Maisie's experience from the air raid had flashed round the factory from one girl to another. Her heart went out to Maisie. It seemed to Miss Cayford that the girl needed something to take her mind off things. With this in mind, She placed the 3 files to one side and added Maisie Miles's file on top at a right angle. "Let's get you settled in, shall we?" It was 2 weeks following her harrowing experience of being dangled on the end of a rope that yet another Monday came round, and Maisie was thankful that it did. 2 weeks wasn't that long, but enough to ease her nightmares and resume being her old self. Tea and toast sat on the breakfast table. There was a fire in the range, and her grandmother seemed perfectly happy providing for the granddaughter who had only lately entered her life. Whilst running the brush through her tangled locks, Maisie caught sight of her face. A haunted look remained in her eyes, and her complexion, usually a warm coffee colour, looked a little paler than usual. She felt her grandmother's eyes on her. "You're doing too much. Work and this ambulance driving?" "I have to." "Of course you do." The statement was very matter-of-fact. Grace Wells understood where others would not. Like her, Maisie was the sort who fought her way through problems and coped with them. Neither were the sort to crumble into helpless self-pity. Maisie wanted to be busy and do all she could for the war effort. After swallowing a slice of toast and gulping down sugarless tea, Maisie said a swift goodbye to her grandmother and headed for the bus stop. Some in the queue for the bus were grumbling about the rain. Some just put up with it as they did everything in this war. The bus from Totterdown to Bedminster Bridge was packed. The windows steamed up thanks to the wet clothes of those who'd been caught in the morning shower. She heard people talking. Most of it was personal. How difficult it was to stretch the rations, how one of the neighbours was being over-friendly with foreign troops. "There was blacks in the pub the other night from the West Indies. Very polite they were and didn't get drunk."
"I likes the Canadians myself."
"Met any Australians, have you?"
"No, have you?"
"No. Bumped into some Polish, though. Couldn't understand a word they were saying."
Threaded through it were comments about the latest air raid.
15 killed, I hear."
"I heard it was more."
"Somebody said a black market pig was found in that raid back at the beginning of this month."
"Won't mind a pound of bacon from that, no matter the price."
"Bet that all got fried and roasted weeks ago."
Laughter followed. Life went on. People had died, but life went on. The factory was the same as it always was. Ordinary things were going on there, too. Her workmates' chatter was all around, plus the music and news on the wireless. Announcements came over the factory tannoy system about air raid duty and a request for volunteers to hoist the barrage balloons in Victoria Park. The lunchtime menu was also announced. Yet again liver and onions with mashed potato, followed by bread and butter pudding, margarine substituting for butter. Maisie sighed. She felt strangely alone. The place where Bridget used to sit was unoccupied, as were 4 other stools. 2 of those who'd sat there had married, and at their husbands' insistence had left. The other 2 had been called up and had gone gladly. No more tobacco for them, they'd giggled. Their exuberance at going into uniform had melted away once they'd been told that Reveille, getting up time, was around 5:30 in the morning, and that square bashing, marching up and down in ill-fitting shoes, was outright torture. Not that they'd had a choice. It had come as no great surprise that Bridget, who had worked at the factory since she'd left school, was trained and promoted to cigarette checking and packing. Before the war, it had constituted 2 separate jobs, but as the workforce had shrunk, it was now a case of one operative carrying out 2 jobs. At the same time as Bridget was given promotion, just a few weeks ago, Miss Cayford had approached Maisie about supervising new recruits to the factory. She was as prepared as she ever would be for the new employees who were starting today. Miss Cayford would bring them along when all the paperwork was in order, just as she'd done when Maisie had started work in Wills back in 1939. Being given responsibility for her section hadn't come as a great surprise. When asked what she'd thought of the idea, she'd assured Miss Cayford that she would do her best. Miss Cayford had responded that she didn't doubt it.
"I have great faith in you," she'd said. "I know I'm placing a big responsibility onto your shoulders, along with my reputation for delegating to the right people. Please don't let me down." "I won't let you down," returned Maisie, shaking her head emphatically and standing straighter and taller, as though that in itself would make her seem even more deserving of Miss Cayford's trust. Nothing much fazed her, and dealing with immature young girls straight from school, who no doubt thought that they knew it all, was no exception. Like everything else in her life, she would face it head-on and take the new responsibility in her stride. She had left Miss Cayford's office with a spring in her step. She was no longer the new girl, and although she looked young and slender enough for a good wind to blow her away, she was far from that. She grew up in a tough area of the city and could stand up for herself. Woe betide anyone who thought otherwise. Entering the stripping room was like taking command of a ship, or what she imagined it was like. She bent over and whispered into Aggie's ear whilst passing, "I've got to oversee the new girls."
"Of course you have," returned Aggie, showing no sign of surprise. Although it was Miss Cayford who had introduced Maisie to working at the factory, it was Aggie who had kept an eye on her, as she did most of her chicks, as she called the younger women and girls she worked with. The lack of surprise was disappointing. Maisie had so wanted her to be surprised and burst with congratulations.
"I know I can do it. I'm not too young or too small,"
Maisie said, as if that was the reason for Aggie's less than enthusiastic response. Though she harboured few misgivings, she craved Aggie's encouragement. Aggie Hill was a big person with a big heart. She was motherly towards all the girls, but especially to Maisie, who had lived with her for a while at the Clandoga, the pub she ran with her husband Curly, before local gangster Eddie Bridgman had dropped in. That was when Maisie moved in with her grandmother. Anything to avoid Eddie. But Aggie still had a soft spot for the girl who had looked forlorn and lost when she'd first come to the factory. Aggie reassured her.
"No, you ain't too young or too small. You might be only pint-sized, but I wouldn't cross you,"
laughed Aggie, her big belly wobbling, her arms holding up a sack of tobacco leaves as though they weighed no more than a few ounces. But then Aggie could do that. She was a big woman with big arms and hands that could just as well wring the neck of a man as that of a chicken. Now, alone at her workstation waiting for the new arrivals, Maisie pondered on all the changes that had happened. Bridget now worked in the packing department, and Phyllis had joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. The factory workforce had been reduced to coincide with its falling supply of tobacco. The Atlantic was crawling with enemy submarines. Ships carrying tobacco from America, Rhodesia and India were all fair game for German torpedoes, and although they were receiving some supplies, they were greatly reduced, food and armaments having priority. It was agreed by all that they were having a hard time. The letter that had arrived from Phyllis had lifted their spirits.
"I'm aiming to be stationed abroad, hopefully somewhere warm where there's plenty of food and no air raids. I'd like blue seas and warm sunshine."
The letter had been passed round, and it was agreed by everyone that life outside the factory walls sounded wonderful. But Maisie wasn't so sure. The factory was like a second home, definitely a big improvement than the one in which she'd grown up. Perhaps if she'd had Phyllis's life with Robert, the husband from hell as far as she was concerned, she might have thought differently. Maisie looked up as Miss Cayford approached, the 3 new recruits trailing in her wake. Smiles were exchanged, and it occurred to her that Miss Cayford had not been left untouched by their present circumstances. She was definitely looking a little older now, thick shanks of grey, wiry hair threading back from her forehead into the original dark brown.
She was a very private person, so nobody really knew anything of her personal life. However, she was a good sort. It was her who had initially inducted Maisie when she'd first arrived at the tobacco factory, and now instructed her to oversee the new girls. "Carol, Pauline and Jane and you here. I know I can trust you to show them the ropes, just like Bridget and Phyllis did when you first started." Miss Caford's smile was warm, but Maisie sensed flattery in an effort to encourage her to take on extra responsibility. There would be a slight increase in wages, though not enough to compensate doing her job. There was also, of course, the extra responsibility of war work. Miss Caford was also required to put in the same effort, holding down her day job, plus doing whatever else in the way of war work required of her. It was rumoured that she was also looking after aged parents. Miss Caford, a gold ring with a red stone flashing, waved her hand towards Maisie by way of introduction. "This is Maisie Miles. She'll get you settled in and show you what you must do. I've already shown you the cloakroom and canteen, but Maisie will point you in the right direction should you get lost," said Miss Caford. "Over to you, Maisie." Maisie managed a weak smile. "Don't hesitate to come along to my office if you have any problems," Miss Caford added. Maisie took the list detailing the girls' names and thanked her. For a brief moment her eyes met those of the older woman before she was left to her own devices. "Right then, let's all get to know each other, shall we? I'm Maisie Miles. Now this isn't a hard job, it's just a bit boring. Same thing over and over again. Strip tobacco leaves, throw the stalks to one side and put the leaves into a basket." They gave no sign of whether they understood or not, though one of them looked totally bored even before she'd done anything. A varied bunch, she thought, as she studied the new arrivals. One girl shivered like a blancmange, so was obviously nervous. Another looked bewildered, and the girl with the folded arms looked hostile. All three were not long out of school, just as she had been when first starting, and she couldn't help but empathise with each of them and their feelings. All the same, she knew they would try her, or at least one of them would. "Here goes," she thought, glancing at the list Miss Caford had handed her. She took a deep breath and fixed all three with a very firm and direct look. "Right.